The dog who saved a life by breaking every rule. "Daddy, where are you? I'm so cold." Those were the words that shattered the silence of a Montana blizzard, spoken by a 6-year-old girl who had been sitting alone in 2 feet of snow for nearly 3 hours. But this wasn't just any child, and what happened next would expose a conspiracy so twisted it would change everything we thought we knew about trust, family, and the incredible bond between humans and their 4-legged guardians. Atlas, a battle-scarred German shepherd with amber eyes that had seen too much war, did something that night that defied every rule in his military training manual. He abandoned his post. He broke protocol. And in doing so, he uncovered a truth that would save not just one little girl's life, but reveal a network of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. What you're about to discover will make you question everything you think you know about the people we trust with our most precious treasures. The wind howled like a wounded animal against the log walls of Marcus Thompson's cabin, rattling windows that hadn't been properly sealed in 3 years. Inside, the silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest until breathing becomes a conscious effort. Marcus sat in his worn leather recliner, the same chair where he'd held his son Michael for countless bedtime stories, now staring at the dying embers in the stone fireplace. The orange glow cast dancing shadows across walls lined with covered photographs, each frame turned face down like sleeping soldiers. At 42, Marcus still carried the broad shoulders of a man built for battle, but grief had carved deep lines around his gray-blue eyes. His sandy brown hair, now streaked with premature silver, fell across his forehead as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The flannel shirt hung loose on his frame. He'd lost 30 pounds since that December night, when a drunk driver's headlights became the last thing his wife Sarah and 8-year-old Michael ever saw. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, but who was counting? The cabin told the story of a life interrupted. Children's toys remained packed in cardboard boxes, stacked against the far wall, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Michael's baseball glove sat on the mantel, positioned exactly where his small hands had left it. Sarah's reading glasses still marked page 247 of the romance novel she'd never finish. Marcus had tried once to pack them away, but his hands had trembled so violently that Atlas, his constant shadow, had pressed against his legs until he'd stopped. Another night, another ghost dance. Marcus murmured to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. He'd developed the habit of speaking aloud, partly to break the suffocating silence, partly because the sound of his own voice reminded him he was still alive, still here, still breathing when they couldn't. The routine never changed. Every evening at precisely 2100 hours, old military habits died hard. Marcus would walk the perimeter of the cabin, check the locks on both doors, test the security system's red light, ensure the generator had fuel for the night. Then he'd avoid the family room where Michael's Nintendo still sat connected to the television, where Sarah's knitting basket held a half-finished scarf meant for a Christmas that never came. The memories always found him anyway. Sarah's laugh echoing through rooms that now knew only silence. Michael's voice calling, "Daddy, watch this," from a childhood that existed now only in Marcus's fractured heart. Some nights the flashbacks would blend together. Sarah reaching for him across a hospital gurney, Michael's small hand going limp in his. Then suddenly he'd be back in Kandahar province, watching David Chen load another magazine while insurgent fire peppered the concrete walls around them. "Stay sharp, Thompson," David's voice would echo across time. My little girl's counting on both of us to make it home. David had carried Emma's photograph in his helmet, talked about her constantly during the long desert nights, when sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Marcus had envied that devotion then, not understanding that love could be both salvation and curse. Now, Marcus understood too well. Love was the weight that made every breath feel stolen, every sunrise feel like betrayal. He'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, faced down insurgents and roadside bombs, earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but he couldn't survive a December intersection, where black ice turned a simple drive for Christmas shopping into a collision that shattered every dream he'd ever held. The guilt gnawed at him with relentless hunger. Why hadn't he driven that night instead of letting Sarah take Michael to the store? Why had his meeting with the VA counselor run late? Why had he survived when his wife, his son, his entire reason for breathing had been stolen in 37 seconds of twisted metal and broken glass? Atlas stirred from his position by the fireplace, amber eyes reflecting the dying flames. The German shepherd's presence was the only thing that kept Marcus tethered to the living world. Without Atlas, Marcus knew he would have followed Sarah and Michael into whatever waited beyond. Some nights he still considered it, but Atlas seemed to sense those dark moments, would press his graying muzzle against Marcus's hand and anchor him with the simple reminder that duty remained. Even in this haunted solitude, even in this cabin that had become a shrine to everything he'd lost, Marcus Thompson was still a soldier, still responsible for the battle-scarred dog who'd served beside him through hell and back, still breathing, still standing, still fighting a war against grief that had no clear victory conditions. The wind howled again, stronger now, and somewhere in its voice, Marcus heard echoes of his son's laughter, his wife's whispered prayers, and David Chen's promise that they'd all make it home safe. Some promises, Marcus had learned, were harder to keep than others. Atlas raised his head from his paws, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. At 7 years old, the German shepherd still possessed the alertness that had made him legendary among the K-9 units in Afghanistan. But time and battle had left their marks. A jagged scar ran along his left flank where shrapnel had torn through muscle and fur during a mortar attack in Helmand province. His muzzle, once pure black, now wore a distinguished silver that caught the firelight like frost on winter grass. But his eyes, those intense amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, remained as sharp as the day Marcus had first met him, outside a forward operating base in Kandahar. They were the eyes of a warrior who'd never learned to quit, a guardian who'd appointed himself protector of the broken man who'd become his entire world. Atlas measured 36 inches at the shoulder and weighed 85 pounds of pure muscle memory and trained instinct. Despite his age, he still carried himself with military precision, back straight, head high, every movement calculated and purposeful. His black and tan coat, though dulled slightly with age, remained thick and well-maintained. Marcus brushed it religiously every morning, a ritual that served them both. For Atlas, it was attention and care. For Marcus, it was 20 minutes, when his hands had purpose beyond holding memories. The bond between them transcended the typical relationship between man and dog. They'd survived 3 deployments together, faced enemy fire side by side, and learned to read each other's thoughts with the telepathic precision that combat veterans develop when survival depends on split-second communication. Atlas had been trained in explosive detection, his nose capable of identifying the chemical signatures of IEDs from hundreds of yards away. But his most valuable skill had emerged naturally, an almost supernatural ability to sense emotional distress, to detect the invisible wounds that plagued soldiers long after the physical battles ended. When Marcus had returned home to find his family's funeral already planned, when the grief had threatened to drag him under like quicksand, Atlas had simply appeared. No dramatic gestures, no obvious comfort, just presence. The dog would position himself wherever Marcus was, close enough to provide reassurance, but far enough to avoid feeling intrusive. On the nights when flashbacks and survivor's guilt created a perfect storm of anguish, Atlas would rest his head on Marcus's chest, providing weight and warmth that somehow anchored his human to the present moment. They developed their own language over the years. A low whine meant Atlas needed to go outside. The subtle communications that mattered most. The way Atlas would lean against Marcus's leg when anxiety spiked. How he'd bring his favorite tennis ball when he sensed depression deepening. The gentle pressure of his paw on Marcus's foot during particularly vivid nightmares. Tonight, however, Atlas was displaying behavior Marcus hadn't seen since their military days. The dog paced restlessly between the fireplace and the front door, pausing every few steps to cock his head toward the windows. His ears remained pricked forward in a state of constant alertness, rotating like radar dishes, seeking signals beyond human perception. Marcus had learned to trust Atlas's instincts absolutely. The dog had saved their unit countless times by detecting threats that sophisticated equipment missed. If Atlas sensed something, something was there. Whether it was an explosive device buried in a dusty road, or trouble brewing in the Montana wilderness. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked. But Atlas only whined softly and continued his patrol pattern. The behavior was purposeful, professional. Not the random restlessness of an aging dog, but the focused vigilance of a soldier on duty. Atlas had been David Chen's dog originally, assigned to David's unit during their second deployment. When David had been killed by a sniper's bullet during their final month in country, Atlas had simply transferred his loyalty to Marcus. No paperwork, no formal reassignment, just a grief-stricken dog choosing the man who understood loss, who carried the same invisible wounds that war leaves on a soul. Marcus sometimes wondered if Atlas missed David the way he missed his own family. Did dogs dream of fallen handlers? Did they carry guilt for surviving when their humans didn't? Did they understand that coming home didn't always mean safety? The German shepherd paused at the front door, placing one paw against the wood while looking back at Marcus with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. It was a look Marcus recognized from their combat days. The focused attention of a partner trying to communicate critical information across the species barrier. Atlas whined again, softer this time, more insistent. His tail remained low but alert, and his entire body language suggested controlled urgency. Something was calling to him through the storm, something that demanded investigation. Marcus glanced at his watch. 2,147 hours. The wind outside had intensified, and the temperature was dropping fast. Whatever Atlas sensed, it was important enough to overcome his usual evening lethargy. "All right, partner," Marcus said, reaching for his coat. "If you think we need to check something out, we check it out." Atlas's tail gave a single wag of approval, and he moved to his position by the door, ready, waiting, trusting that his human would follow where duty led. After all these years, Marcus thought, the dog still believed in missions worth completing. The blizzard struck Pine Haven, like divine judgment, transforming the quiet Montana town into a frozen wasteland within hours. Wind speeds had climbed past 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally through the air with the force of crystalline bullets. Power lines sagged under accumulating ice, and the few street lights that remained operational cast eerie halos through the swirling white chaos. Marcus pulled on his heavy winter coat, the same military-issued parka that had kept him alive during brutal Afghan winters, while Atlas waited by the door with the patience of a soldier accustomed to sudden deployments. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read -18 degrees Fahrenheit and falling, the kind of cold that could kill the unprepared in minutes, that turned exposed skin to marble and breath to clouds of ice crystals. "We shouldn't be going anywhere in this weather," Marcus muttered. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. Atlas's behavior had escalated from restless to urgent, and 3 tours in combat zones had taught Marcus never to ignore his partner's instincts. The dog's nose could detect explosives buried 3 feet underground. His ears could distinguish between friendly and hostile footsteps from hundreds of yards away. If Atlas believed something required their immediate attention, Marcus would follow him into hell itself. They stepped outside into nature's fury, and the cold hit Marcus like a physical blow. The wind drove snow into every exposed inch of skin, and within seconds his beard had accumulated a layer of frost. Atlas, protected by his thick double coat, moved with sure-footed confidence across the driveway, where Marcus's pickup truck sat buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. It took 15 minutes to dig out the truck, 15 minutes of back-breaking labor while the storm raged around them. Marcus's hands, even protected by insulated gloves, began to ache with cold. His breath came in short puffs that froze instantly in the frigid air. But Atlas remained alert and patient, occasionally barking encouragement as if to say, "Keep going, this is important." The truck's engine protested the cold but finally turned over, diesel rumbling to life with the reliable steadiness that had made Marcus buy it in the first place. He let it warm up while scraping ice from the windshield, Atlas already positioned in the passenger seat like a co-pilot ready for takeoff. Pine Haven looked like a ghost town as they drove slowly through streets thick with snow. The few businesses that remained open, Pete's Diner, Murphy's gas station, the ancient pharmacy that had served the community for 60 years, had their windows boarded against the wind. No sane person ventured out in weather like this unless absolutely necessary. The truck's headlights carved weak tunnels drive, and his own combat-trained reflexes to navigate roads that had disappeared beneath blankets of white. Atlas rode beside him in complete silence, but his body language spoke volumes. The dog's ears remained fixed forward, his nose occasionally lifting to test the air flowing through the heating vents. Whatever had triggered his alert response was growing stronger, more urgent. They reached the intersection where Elm Street met Riverside Drive, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar dread. This was where the choice always waited. Take the direct route home through the town center, or follow Riverside Drive, past the cemetery where his family was buried. For 3 years, he'd chosen the direct route, unable to face the memories that lived in that stretch of road. But tonight, Atlas whined softly and pressed his nose against the passenger window, looking toward Riverside Drive with unmistakable insistence. "You want to go that way?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. Atlas's tail thumped once against the seat, their signal for yes, and his amber eyes held Marcus's gaze with the intensity of a partner making a critical battlefield request. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Riverside Drive would take them past the cemetery, past the curve where black ice and a drunk driver had stolen everything that mattered, past the stretch of guardrail that still bore scars from twisted metal and shattered dreams. But Atlas had never steered him wrong. Not in Afghanistan, not during the dark months after the funeral, not during the countless nights when grief had nearly claimed another casualty. "All right, boy," Marcus whispered, turning the wheel toward Riverside Drive. "If you think we need to go that way, we go that way." The truck moved slowly through the storm, headlights sweeping across snow-covered trees and fence posts that looked like sentries standing guard over the frozen landscape. The cemetery gates appeared through the blowing snow, like the entrance to another world. Iron bars, black against the white night. And that's when Atlas erupted into motion, not barking, not aggressive, but alert in a way that made every hair on Marcus's neck stand at attention. The dog pressed against the window, breath fogging the glass, as he stared at something beyond the cemetery gates. Marcus slowed the truck to a crawl, wiping condensation from the windshield with his sleeve. At first, he saw nothing but snow and shadows dancing in the weak beam, pulling the truck to the side of the road. The storm had led them here. Atlas had led them here, to save a life that was measured now in minutes, not hours. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, Atlas leaping out behind him into the howling night. Together, they ran toward the cemetery gates, toward the small figure who waited in the snow like an answer to prayers Marcus hadn't known he was still capable of saying. Behind them, the truck's hazard lights blinked rhythmically in the storm, marking the moment when a routine drive through a blizzard became something else entirely, something that would change everything. The beam of Marcus's flashlight cut through the swirling snow like a blade, revealing what his heart had refused to believe. There, pressed against the cemetery's wrought iron gates, as if seeking entry to the world of the dead, sat a child, so still she might have been carved from ice itself. Emma Chen, though Marcus didn't yet know her name, was 6 years old, but hypothermia had stolen the rosy warmth from her cheeks, leaving her delicate Asian-American features painted in shades of blue and gray that spoke of minutes, not hours, before irreversible damage claimed another victim. She wore only a thin, purple dress that clung to her small frame like wet tissue paper, the fabric torn in several places and stained with mud and snow. Her legs, bare except for torn white stockings that had once been pristine, were tucked beneath her in a futile attempt to preserve body heat. No coat, no shoes, no protection against a Montana blizzard that could kill a grown man in 30 minutes, let alone a child who weighed maybe 40 pounds soaking wet. But it was her hands that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Tiny fingers, blue-black with frostbite, clutched a wooden picture frame against her chest with the desperate grip of someone holding on to the last piece of their world. Even through the storm, even in the inadequate beam of his flashlight, Marcus could see that she protected that photograph like a talisman, like a prayer made tangible. "Sweet Jesus," Marcus whispered, his words snatched away by the howling wind. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside her, careful not to make sudden movements that might startle a child already balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. Up close, he could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest, shallow, too slow, but still breathing, still fighting. The photograph she clutched was a military portrait, formal and proud, in the way that captured soldiers at their finest moment. The frame was scratched and weathered, as if it had been handled countless times by small fingers seeking comfort. Through the cracked glass, Marcus saw a face that stopped his heart cold. Theota David Chen, in full-dress blues, his dark eyes sparkling with the happiness of people who believed the future held nothing but promise. The recognition hit Marcus like a sniper's bullet, sudden, devastating, and absolute. David Chen, his battle brother, his foxhole companion, the man who'd saved his life during a Taliban ambush in the Korangal Valley. David, who'd talked about his baby daughter every single day of their deployment, who'd carried this same photograph tucked inside his helmet, who'd made Marcus promise to watch over his little girl if anything ever happened. "Emma," Marcus breathed, and the child's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her name. They were David's eyes, dark brown, intelligent, but now glazed with the early stages of hypothermic confusion. Still, something flickered in their depths when she looked at Marcus, a spark of recognition that defied medical explanation. Atlas moved before Marcus could speak again, his military training overriding everything else. The German shepherd approached Emma with the careful precision of a bomb disposal expert, every movement calculated to avoid causing alarm. He didn't bound forward or bark excitedly like a typical dog meeting a child. Instead, he lowered himself to the ground and army-crawled the final few feet, presenting himself as non-threatening, as safe. Without hesitation, Atlas curved his body around Emma's left side, pressing his thick coat against her frozen form, while being careful not to dislodge her grip on the photograph. The dog's body heat began working immediately, and Marcus watched Emma's breathing deepen slightly as warmth seeped through her dress. Atlas rested his graying muzzle near her shoulder, his amber eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that said, "I've got her. Do what you need to do." Marcus shrugged out of his army surplus jacket, the heavy winter coat that had kept him alive through Afghan blizzards, and wrapped it around Emma's shoulders. The jacket engulfed her tiny frame, but it would trap her remaining body heat and buy them precious time. Her skin felt like ice beneath his fingers, and he could see the telltale white patches of frostbite on her nose and ears. "I know who you are, sweetheart," Marcus said in the calm, steady voice he'd used to comfort wounded soldiers in combat zones. "Your daddy was my friend, my very best friend, and I'm going to take care of you now, okay?" Emma's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her eyes tracked his face with the desperate attention of someone trying to determine if salvation had arrived, or if this was just another cruel trick in a world that had already stolen too much. Marcus slipped one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back, lifting her with the careful precision of someone handling explosive ordnance. Toward the truck, Atlas maintained his position as flank guard, trotting alongside them with his ears rotating constantly, scanning for threats that might emerge from the storm. The dog's protective instincts had engaged completely, transforming him from aging pet to active duty guardian in the space of heartbeats. Emma's head lolled against Marcus's shoulder, and he felt her fingers relax slightly around the photograph's frame. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed to understand that she was safe, that someone had finally come for her. That David Chen's promise to his daughter, delivered through channels neither man could have imagined, was being kept at last. The truck's engine continued rumbling in the distance, hazard lights blinking like a beacon in the storm, marking the moment when Marcus Thompson stopped being a man who simply survived each day and became someone with a reason to fight for tomorrow. Inside the truck's cab, with the heater running full blast and Atlas pressed against Emma's legs, the child began to thaw in ways that went beyond physical warmth. Her lips, no longer blue-black with cold, parted slightly as feeling returned to her face. Marcus had positioned her between himself and Atlas, creating a cocoon of body heat while they waited for the truck's interior to reach a temperature that wouldn't shock her system. The photograph remained clutched in her small hands, but Marcus could now see it clearly in the dashboard's soft glow. David looked exactly as Marcus remembered him, confident smile, eyes bright with intelligence and humor, the slight scar on his left temple from where shrapnel had grazed him during their first deployment. The baby in his arms was perfect, with David's dark hair and what would clearly become her father's determined jawline. "Uncle Marcus?" The words came as barely a whisper, so soft that Marcus almost missed them over the truck's rumbling engine. But Atlas's ears pricked forward, and the dog's tail gave a single thump against the seat, their old signal that something important had been said. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. "Yes, sweetheart. That's right. Your daddy told you about me?" Emma nodded slowly, her movements still sluggish from hypothermia, but growing stronger by the moment. He said, if anything bad happened, I should find Uncle Marcus and Atlas. He said you would keep me safe, like you kept him safe in the war." The trust in her voice was simultaneously heartbreaking and terrifying. Here was a child who'd been abandoned in a blizzard, left to die in sub-zero temperatures, and yet she spoke with the absolute faith of someone who'd always been taught that Marcus extracting information from traumatized civilians in war zones. Never push, never demand, just create space for truth to emerge naturally. Emma's grip tightened on the photograph, and for a moment she looked far older than her 6 years. "Richard, my stepdaddy. He said," she paused, swallowing hard, "he said this is where broken children belong, with the other broken things that nobody wants anymore." The casual cruelty of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Atlas growled low in his throat, a sound that spoke of barely controlled violence. The dog's protective instincts had locked onto Emma completely, and hearing about her mistreatment was triggering responses that went back to their military days, when protecting civilians had been their primary mission. "Richard said Daddy was never coming home because he was ashamed of me," Emma continued, her voice growing smaller with each word. "He said nobody wanted a broken little girl who caused too much trouble." Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. "Your daddy wasn't ashamed of you, sweetheart. He loved you more than anything in the whole world. He used to show me your picture every single day and tell me how proud he was to be your father." Emma's eyes widened, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered in their depths. "Really? Really? He said you were the smartest, bravest little girl in the whole world, and that when he came home from the war, he was going to teach you how to be strong like a soldier." Slowly, carefully, Emma reached into the torn pocket of her dress and withdrew additional photographs, bent and creased from handling. The first showed her and David at what looked like a playground, both laughing as he pushed her on a swing. Her smile was radiant, her eyes bright with the joy of a child who knew she was loved absolutely. But the second photograph made Marcus's blood run cold. It showed Emma's back, crisscrossed with welts and bruises in various stages of healing. The clinical nature of the image, clearly taken for documentation rather than family memories, suggested systematic abuse over an extended period. "I hid them," Emma whispered. "Richard said if I ever showed anyone, he would put me in the ground next to Daddy. But Daddy told me to always keep proof when grown-ups did bad things." Marcus stared at the evidence of systematic child abuse, his military training warring with parental instincts he'd thought died with Michael. This wasn't just neglect or abandonment. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty inflicted on a child whose only crime was existing. Emma had been tortured by someone who should have protected her, then discarded like trash when she became inconvenient. "Emma, where's your mother?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mommy went away after she married Richard. He said she didn't want me anymore because I—" Emma's voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd been forced to accept unacceptable truths. "He said nobody would ever want a broken little girl. Except maybe the people in the ground." Atlas shifted position, placing his head more firmly across Emma's lap, while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. The message was clear. This child was now under their protection, and anyone who threatened her would have to go through both of them. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of being locked in place. For the first time since losing his family, he wasn't just surviving, he was needed. David's daughter, the little girl his battle brother had talked about every day for 3 tours, was alive and requiring the same protection Marcus had once provided her father. "Will you come home with me, Emma?" Marcus asked. "Will you let me and Atlas take care of you the way your daddy asked us to?" Emma looked at the photograph of her father, then at Atlas, then finally at Marcus. In her eyes he saw an intelligence that had been forced to mature too quickly, a wisdom born of suffering that no child should possess. "Daddy said you never break promises," she whispered. "Never," Marcus confirmed. "Then yes, I want to go home with you and Atlas." As Marcus carefully lifted Emma to reposition her for the drive home, Atlas resumed his protective stance beside them both. The dog's amber eyes held steady purpose. His mission parameters had just changed, from keeping one broken soldier alive to protecting a small girl who carried his former handler's legacy. The blizzard continued raging outside, but inside the truck's cab something warmer than heated air had begun to flow. Hope, fragile and new, but undeniably real. The drive back to Marcus's cabin took twice as long as usual. Not because of the storm, though it continued to rage with biblical fury, but because Marcus found himself checking on Emma every few seconds, terrified that hypothermia might still claim her despite the truck's warmth. She'd fallen asleep against his right arm, her small body finally relaxing as circulation returned to her extremities and exhaustion claimed its due. The photograph of her father remained pressed against her chest like a shield, even in sleep. Atlas had positioned himself as a living seatbelt, his bulk preventing Emma from sliding during turns, while his body heat continued the warming process that would save her life. The German shepherd's amber eyes never left her face, monitoring her breathing with the vigilance of a soldier standing watch over wounded comrades. Occasionally he would adjust his position to ensure optimal heat transfer, his movements so gentle they didn't disturb her sleep. As the miles passed, memories of David Chen flooded through Marcus's consciousness, someone who understood that attention to detail meant survival. David reading letters from home by flashlight in their shared bunker, his face transforming with joy every time he mentioned his baby daughter. "She's walking now, Thompson," David had said during their final deployment, showing Marcus a video on his satellite phone. "Look at those little legs go. By the time I get home, she'll probably be running marathons." The pride in his voice had been absolute, the kind of love that makes men fight harder, because they have something worth coming home to. Marcus remembered the letters David wrote every night, religious in their consistency. Letters to his wife Sarah about their future plans. Letters to baby Emma that she'd read when she was older, full of promises about tea parties and piggyback rides and bedtime stories that would chase away all the monsters. David had been building a foundation of love through correspondence, creating a relationship with his daughter across continents and time zones. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a familiar pack. He'd been entrusted with David's most precious treasure, the little girl who represented everything his battle brother had lived and died for. But how could he care for a traumatized child when he could barely manage his own trauma? How could he provide the stability Emma needed when his own life was held together with routine and stubbornness? The doubt gnawed at him as they navigated snow-covered roads that seemed determined to swallow the truck whole. Marcus had failed to protect his own family. Michael and Sarah had died while he was sitting in a VA counselor's office, talking about nightmares and survivor's guilt instead of being where he belonged. What made him think he could succeed where he'd already proven inadequate? But Atlas seemed to sense his internal struggle. Without disturbing Emma's sleep, the dog stretched his neck far enough to rest his muzzle on Marcus's shoulder for just a moment, a gesture of reassurance that spoke volumes. They'd kept each other alive through 3 tours of combat, through grief that should have killed them both, through nights when the only thing standing between Marcus and surrender had been Atlas's unwavering presence. If they could survive war and loss, they could figure out how to raise one small girl who needed them to be stronger than their scars. The cabin appeared through the storm, like a lighthouse beacon, its windows glowing with warmth that had been absent for too long. Marcus pulled as close to the front door as possible, knowing that every second of exposure could be dangerous for Emma in her weakened condition. The wind had intensified during their drive, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, according to the truck's display. Atlas jumped down first, immediately taking up a protective position beside the truck while scanning for threats that might emerge from the storm. His military training remained as sharp as ever. Secure the perimeter, identify potential dangers, maintain situational awareness at all times. The dog's breath created crystalline clouds in the frigid air, but his stance remained steady and alert. Marcus gathered Emma carefully, wrapping his jacket more securely around her small form before stepping out into the blizzard. She stirred slightly as the cold air hit them, but didn't wake, her trust absolute even in unconsciousness. The symbolic weight of carrying David's daughter across the threshold of his home wasn't lost on Marcus. It was a moment that felt like benediction and burden combined, like being entrusted with something sacred. Inside the cabin, warmth enveloped them immediately. The stone fireplace still held glowing embers from earlier, and the familiar scent of home. Pine logs, leather furniture, and the lingering ghost of Sarah's vanilla candles seemed to welcome them. But the silence that had been Marcus's constant companion for 3 years felt different now, charged with possibility rather than emptiness. Atlas trotted ahead, leading them toward the hallway that Marcus hadn't walked down in 3 years. Michael's room waited at the end, exactly as it had been left the night before the accident. Star Wars posters on the walls, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, a twin bed with superhero sheets that had been Marcus's Christmas surprise. Standing at the threshold, Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar grief. This room had been a shrine to everything he'd lost, a museum of dreams that would never be fulfilled. But as he looked down at Emma's sleeping face, he realized that shrines were meant to honor the dead, not imprison the living. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he whispered, stepping into Michael's room for the first time since the funeral. He laid Emma gently on the bed, tucking the superhero sheets around her small form. She stirred briefly, her fingers tightening on David's photograph, but remained deeply asleep. Atlas immediately took up position beside the bed, settling onto the carpet with a soft sigh that spoke of duty accepted and responsibility embraced. As Marcus adjusted the room's temperature and checked that the window was secure against the storm, he felt something shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The oppressive weight of grief remained, but it was no longer the only presence in these rooms. Life had returned, fragile and wounded, but unmistakably real. He paused at the doorway, watching Atlas position himself as Emma's guardian, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of the nightlight that hadn't been turned on in 3 years. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana wilderness, but inside the cabin, something precious was being protected. David Chen's daughter, that tomorrow might hold something other than mere survival. Atlas's tail thumped once against the carpet, their old signal that the watch was set, the perimeter was secure, and all was well. The long night was just beginning, but they would face it together. At 3:17 a.m., Emma's screams shattered the cabin's peace like artillery fire, ripping Marcus from the light sleep he'd managed while keeping watch from the hallway chair. The sound was primal, desperate, the kind of terror that comes from reliving trauma so vivid it overwrites reality. Her small body thrashed against Michael's superhero sheets, arms flailing as if fighting off invisible attackers. Her voice cracking as she called out in Mandarin and English, begging her father to come back, pleading with someone to stop hurting her. Marcus bolted from his chair, but Atlas was already in motion. The German Shepherd had been lying beside Emma's bed in a state of alert rest, the combat veteran's ability to sleep while remaining ready for immediate action. As Emma's nightmare escalated, Atlas didn't bark or whine. Instead, he performed a sequence of movements that Marcus recognized with stunning clarity from their military service, movements that had been drilled into the dog through countless hours of specialized training. Atlas placed his right front paw gently but firmly on Emma's chest, just over her heart. His amber eyes locked onto her face with laser focus, and he began breathing in deep, controlled rhythms. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. The technique was designed to regulate heart rate and breathing in trauma victims, to provide a physical anchor that could pull someone back from the abyss of flashback-induced panic. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, recognizing the PTSD intervention protocol that Atlas had used on wounded soldiers in field hospitals across Afghanistan. The dog remembered everything, not just the commands and positions, but the purpose behind them. Atlas understood that Emma was trapped in the same kind of psychological battlefield that had claimed so many of their brothers in arms. Emma's thrashing began to slow as Atlas maintained his position, his steady breathing creating a rhythm that her panicked system could follow. Her screams faded to whimpers, then to the rapid, shallow breathing of someone climbing out of a nightmare's grip. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild, but gradually settling on Atlas's calm presence. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small and broken. "Daddy, where are you?" Atlas shifted slightly, maintaining the pressure on her chest while bringing his muzzle closer to her face. He exhaled gently, his breath warm against her cheek, and made a soft sound. Not the dog was performing therapy at a level that most trained professionals couldn't achieve, reading her physiological responses and adjusting his intervention accordingly. This wasn't just instinct, this was learned behavior, muscle memory from treating combat trauma in soldiers who'd carried wounds that couldn't be stitched closed. As Emma's panic subsided, Atlas began exhibiting behavior that made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. The dog's nose twitched as he scented the air around Emma's belongings, the torn purple dress, the battered photograph, even the faded blanket she'd been wrapped in. His reaction was unmistakable. He was recognizing something familiar, something that triggered memories deeper than training. David's scent, The unique combination of military-issued cologne, the specific pheromones of his bloodline, and whatever indefinable essence makes one person's belongings immediately recognizable to a dog who'd served beside him for 3 years. Atlas wasn't just helping a traumatized child, he was protecting David Chen's daughter, fulfilling a mission that transcended species and understanding. "He smells like Daddy, doesn't he?" Emma asked softly, her small hand reaching out to stroke Atlas's graying muzzle. "Daddy said you and Uncle Marcus would always remember him." The lucidity in her voice was startling. Gone was the confusion and terror of moments before, replaced by an intelligence that contradicted everything Richard Blackwood had claimed about her mental capacity. Emma spoke with the clarity of someone far older, her words precisely chosen and delivered with an understanding of complex emotional dynamics that most adults struggled to achieve. "Richard said I was stupid," Emma continued, her fingers working through Atlas's thick coat. "He said I was broken in my brain and that's why Daddy died in the war. But Daddy told me that some grown-ups lie when they want to take things that don't belong to them." Marcus felt his blood pressure spike. The casual way Emma recounted psychological abuse was perhaps more disturbing than screaming would have been. She'd been conditioned to accept cruelty as normalcy, taught to believe that she was somehow responsible for her father's death and deserving of punishment. "I've been collecting things," Emma said, sitting up slowly while Atlas maintained his protective position. "Daddy taught me that soldiers always gather intelligence on their enemies." She reached into the torn pocket of her dress and withdrew an object that made Marcus's breath catch. An old flip phone, battered and scratched, but obviously functional. "I recorded Richard when he thought I was sleeping," Emma explained with matter-of-fact precision. "He talks to other people about Daddy's money and how to make me disappear if I cause too much trouble. I hide the phone in different places so he can't find it." The sophistication of her survival strategy was breathtaking. This 6-year-old had been conducting counterintelligence operations against her abuser, gathering evidence with the methodical patience of a trained operative. David's daughter had inherited more than his eyes and stubborn chin. She'd inherited his tactical mind and his understanding that information was the most powerful weapon in any conflict. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor, and Marcus realized the sound meant approval. The dog recognized intelligence when he saw it, respected the kind of operational thinking that had kept their unit alive through multiple deployments. Emma wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor who'd been fighting her own war with weapons available to her. "Can I play the recordings for you, Uncle Marcus?" Emma asked, her voice carrying hope mixed with exhaustion. "I think they might help prove that Richard isn't really trying to take care of me." Marcus nodded, understanding that this small girl had just handed him ammunition in a battle he was only beginning to comprehend. But as he looked at Emma, David's daughter, sitting in Michael's bed, protected by Atlas's unwavering vigilance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose. Clear, unambiguous, and absolute. The war for Emma's future had begun, and Marcus Thompson finally had a mission worth completing.
The morning sun painted the cabin's kitchen in shades of gold and amber, a stark contrast to the emotional darkness that had preceded dawn. Marcus moved with military precision around the familiar space, preparing Emma's first real meal in what appeared to have been weeks. Her tiny frame told the story of systematic neglect, ribs visible through the borrowed t-shirt he'd found for her, wrists so thin his fingers could easily encircle them, the hollow cheeks of a child who'd learned not to ask for food because asking only brought punishment. He prepared oatmeal the way Sarah used to make it for Michael: brown sugar, fresh blueberries from the freezer, a dollop of real butter melting into golden pools, fresh orange juice, not the sugary concentrate that passed for nutrition in most households. Whole milk warmed to just the right temperature, fortified with the vitamins and protein that Emma's malnourished body desperately needed. Atlas had positioned himself with tactical precision, his bulk stationed where he could monitor both the front door and the kitchen entrance while maintaining visual contact with Emma. The dog's amber eyes swept the room in regular intervals, checking windows, listening for unusual sounds, his protective instincts operating at full capacity. He'd taken Emma's nighttime terror as confirmation that threats existed beyond the physical realm. Psychological warfare required the same vigilance as incoming mortar fire. Emma sat at the kitchen table in one of Marcus's flannel shirts, the fabric hanging off her small frame like a colorful tent. Her dark hair, now clean and braided, caught the morning light as she watched Marcus work with the intense
attention of someone unused to having needs anticipated and met. When he placed the bowl of oatmeal before her, she stared at it for several seconds, as if unsure it was really intended for her. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Marcus encouraged gently. "It's all yours." Emma began eating with the controlled desperation of someone who'd learned to consume food quickly before it could be taken away. She tried to pace herself, to eat with the manners her father had undoubtedly taught her, but hunger won out over propriety. Marcus watched her devour the oatmeal, his heart breaking with each ravenous spoonful that spoke volumes about the neglect she'd endured. Between bites, Emma began asking questions that revealed the sharp intelligence Richard Blackwood had tried so hard to discredit. "Uncle Marcus, did you and Daddy ever have to eat cold food when you were soldiers? Daddy told me stories about you sharing your rations when his got blown up by a bomb." The specificity of her memory was remarkable. David had clearly spent countless hours telling Emma about their military service, creating a detailed narrative that made his battle brother real and present in his daughter's imagination. Marcus found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The time David had insisted on splitting his last chocolate bar during a 3-day patrol. The way Atlas had learned to detect David's mood changes and provide comfort accordingly. The inside jokes and casual bravery that defined brotherhood forged under fire. "Daddy said you were the bravest soldier in the whole army," Emma said, pausing in her eating to study Marcus's face. "He said you saved his life 7 times, but you never bragged about it because heroes don't need to tell people they're heroes." The hero worship in her voice was both humbling and terrifying. David had created a mythology around Marcus that no human being could live up to, setting expectations that seemed designed to end in disappointment. But as Emma continued talking, Marcus realized that David's stories served a deeper purpose. They'd given his daughter a framework for understanding what protection looked like, what safety felt like, what it meant to have someone willing to fight for you unconditionally. "Richard said Daddy's stories were lies," Emma continued, her voice taking on the flat affect that Marcus recognized as a trauma response. "He said soldiers don't really protect people. They just kill people and then come home broken. He said Daddy died because he was stupid and weak, and that I was stupid and weak too because I believed in fairy tales about heroes." The systematic nature of the psychological abuse became clearer with each revelation. Richard hadn't just neglected Emma, he'd deliberately destroyed her connection to her father's memory, weaponizing her grief and turning it into self-doubt. Every positive association, every source of pride or strength. "Stories weren't lies, were they?" Emma asked, looking directly at Marcus with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "Daddy really did save people, and you really did take care of him. And Atlas really was the best soldier dog in the whole war?" Every word was true, Marcus confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Your daddy was the best man I ever knew, and he loved you more than anything in the entire world." Emma reached into the pocket of the flannel shirt and withdrew a crumpled sheaf of papers, smoothing them carefully on the table beside her empty bowl. The documents were official-looking, complete with letterheads and signatures, but Marcus's trained eye immediately spotted irregularities, font inconsistencies, missing authentication marks, the kind of details that separated legitimate documentation from skillful forgeries. "Richard made me carry these everywhere," Emma explained. "He said they proved I was defective and that normal families couldn't take care of me. He said only special hospitals knew how to handle broken children like me." Marcus scanned the fabricated psychological evaluations, his anger building with each line of fictional pathology. According to these documents, Emma suffered from severe developmental delays, exhibited dangerous behavioral problems, and required institutionalization for her own safety and the protection of others. The clinical language was designed to make her sound like a threat rather than a victim, justifying whatever disposal method Richard had planned. "But I'm not broken, am I, Uncle Marcus?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the tentative hope of someone who'd been told lies so consistently that truth felt foreign. "I can read really good, and I remember everything Daddy taught me, and I know how to be quiet when grown-ups are being scary." The survival skills embedded in that last sentence hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emma had learned to make herself invisible, to become so small and quiet that maybe the monsters would forget she existed. She'd developed the hypervigilance of a combat veteran, reading adult moods and adjusting her behavior to minimize the chance of triggering violence. Atlas moved closer to Emma's chair, resting his head on her lap, while maintaining his watch over the room's entrances. The dog's protective positioning sent a clear message. This child was under his guard now, and anyone who wished her harm would have to go through him first. "You're not broken, Emma," Marcus said firmly. "You're your father's daughter, and that makes you one of the strongest, smartest, bravest people I've ever met. These papers are lies, just like everything else Richard told you." Emma's smile was tentative but genuine, the first real expression of joy Marcus had seen cross her face. For a moment, she looked like the carefree little girl David had bragged about during those long desert nights. Endured. But that moment of peace was about to be shattered by the sound of an approaching vehicle, and Atlas's immediate shift from protective to tactical mode would remind them all that the battle for Emma's future was just beginning. The laptop screen's blue glow illuminated Marcus's grim expression as he scrolled through search results that painted a picture of Richard Blackwood's carefully constructed public persona. Corporate lawyer specializing in estate planning and family law, Harvard Law Review, partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious firms. His professional photograph showed a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled salt-and-pepper hair, expensive suit, and the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never lost a case he cared about winning. But Marcus's military training had taught him to look beyond surface presentations, and the deeper he dug, the more disturbing patterns emerged. Richard's practice specialized in contested inheritances, with a particular focus on challenging the mental competency of beneficiaries. His client testimonials read like a roadmap for legal manipulation, grieving families grateful for his help in protecting unstable relatives from financial decisions they weren't equipped to handle. The marriage license between Richard Blackwood and Sarah Chen was dated just 8 months after David's death. The timing alone was suspicious, but when Marcus cross-referenced it with David's will and military benefits documentation, a clear financial motive crystallized. David had left everything to Emma: $2.3 million in life insurance, disability benefits, a paid-off house in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, plus education funds that would ensure his daughter could attend any university in the country. For someone with Emma under his legal control, Richard would have access to millions of dollars over the next 12 years. But only if Emma remained declared mentally incompetent, unable to advocate for herself or question where her inheritance was going. Atlas's ears snapped to attention, his amber eyes fixed on the front windows. The dog's entire body language shifted from relaxed vigilance to active threat assessment, head raised, muscles tensed, tail rigid. His military training recognized the sound signature before Marcus's ears registered it. A vehicle approaching on the snowy driveway. Engine note suggesting something larger and more expensive than the pickup trucks common in Pine Haven. "Emma, go to your room," Marcus said quietly, closing the laptop. Atlas was already moving, positioning himself between the kitchen table and the front door, his stance making it clear that anyone wanting to reach Emma would have to go through him first. The phone rang before the vehicle had fully stopped outside. Marcus answered on the second ring, and Richard Blackwood's voice filled the kitchen with smooth, professional menace. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you have something that belongs to me." The voice matched the photograph perfectly, cultured, confident, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of winning arguments in courtrooms and boardrooms. But underneath the polished exterior, Marcus detected something else. Barely controlled anger, the frustration of someone whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted. "I have David Chen's daughter," Marcus replied evenly, "and she's staying right where she is." Richard's laugh was cold, calculated. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Emma is my legal ward, and she's severely mentally disturbed. The poor child has been living in a fantasy world since her father's death, and your interference is only making her condition worse." Through the front window, Marcus could see a black Mercedes SUV with Washington state plates. Richard sat behind the wheel, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing as he spoke. He was alone, overconfident perhaps, or genuinely believing that legal authority would be sufficient to reclaim his victim. "I've seen the medical records you fabricated," Marcus said, "and I've heard the recordings Emma made of your conversations about disposing of her if she became too much trouble." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost its professional polish, revealing something darker underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Thompson. I know about your PTSD, your medication, the fact that you've been declared 30% disabled by the VA. Who do you think a family court judge will believe? A successful attorney trying to help his mentally ill stepdaughter, or an unstable veteran with delusions of heroism?" Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, despite Marcus's instructions, drawn by the sound of Richard's voice on speakerphone. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She dropped to the floor as if she'd been shot, curling into a defensive ball with her hands over her head. Atlas abandoned his position at the front door, rushing to Emma's side and placing his body between her and the phone, as if he could physically shield her from psychological assault. The sound of Emma's terrified whimpering through the phone seemed to energize Richard. His voice took on a tone of false concern that made Marcus's skin crawl. "You see, she's having another episode. Emma has these breaks from reality, where she believes her father is still alive, where she thinks people are trying to hurt her when they're only trying to help. She needs professional care, not some damaged veteran playing house with someone else's child." Marcus knelt beside Emma, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, while Atlas maintained his protective position. The little girl was shaking violently, lost in whatever psychological conditioning Richard. Invisible. Survival behaviors learned through repeated trauma. "The only person who's hurt this child is you," Marcus said into the phone, his voice carrying the kind of lethal calm that had preceded violence in combat zones. "And if you set one foot on my property, you'll discover just how unstable this veteran can be." Richard's response was immediate and threatening. "I'll be back with the sheriff and a court order, Thompson. And when I take Emma home, I'll make sure she understands the consequences of running away and telling lies about the people who care for her." The line went dead, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Through the window, Marcus watched the Mercedes back out of his driveway, Richard's face visible through the windshield. Calm, confident, already planning his next move in what he clearly considered a chess game with a predetermined outcome. But Marcus Thompson had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were those who underestimated their opposition. As he helped Emma to her feet and watched Atlas resume his protective vigil, Marcus realized that Richard Blackwood had made a crucial tactical error. He'd revealed his position, his resources, and his intentions. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of callous cruelty that would turn a custody dispute into something far more personal. Marcus reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd researched, but hoped never to need. When the call was answered, he spoke with the clarity of someone who'd finally found his mission objective. "Sofia Rivera, my name is Marcus Thompson, and I need a lawyer who specializes in fighting corrupt systems. I have a little girl who needs protection, and I have evidence that's going to put her abuser in prison." The war for Emma's future had begun in earnest, and Marcus Thompson was finally ready to fight a battle that mattered more than his own survival. Outside, Atlas maintained his watch over the snowy landscape, amber eyes scanning for threats, while his ears monitored the subtle sounds that indicated whether their temporary safety would hold through another night. The answer, Marcus suspected, was probably not. The blizzard hadn't relented since Emma's rescue, and through the swirling white curtain that surrounded Marcus's cabin, headlights appeared like distant stars fighting through cosmic debris. The vehicle that emerged from the storm was a battle-scarred Honda Civic, its paint faded and bumpers bearing the dings and scrapes of someone who drove with purpose rather than vanity. As it pulled into the driveway, Marcus felt Atlas tense beside him, the dog's amber eyes tracking the newcomer with the careful assessment of a sentry evaluating potential threats. The woman who stepped out of the Civic moved with the confident stride of some in courtroom battles and late-night strategy sessions. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had fought the wind and lost, and her navy wool coat bore the kind of professional creases that came from sitting in countless client meetings, where hope hung in a balance. She carried a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, the tools of someone who understood that justice often required endurance more than eloquence. Her boots, practical and waterproof, crunched through the snow with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned not to let weather dictate her schedule. "Marcus Thompson," she called out as she approached the front door, her voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention without demanding submission. "I'm Sofia Rivera. I came as soon as I could after your call." Marcus opened the door, and Atlas immediately positioned himself where he could observe this newcomer, while maintaining his protective stance near Emma's location. The German Shepherd's assessment was thorough, but not aggressive. Ears forward, tail neutral, amber eyes, cataloging every detail of Sofia's movements and demeanor. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Especially in this weather." Sofia stamped snow from her boots and removed her coat, revealing a simple black sweater and dark jeans that suggested someone more concerned with function than fashion. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and when she spoke, her voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish at home and English in courtrooms. "Where's Emma?" she asked immediately, her professional instincts taking precedence over social niceties. "Playing in the kitchen," Marcus replied. "She's been through hell." Sophia's expression darkened with recognition. She'd seen too many children who'd survived systems designed to protect them, who'd learned to navigate adult cruelty with intelligence far beyond their years. Her specialization in children's rights hadn't been a career choice so much as a calling born from personal tragedy. Her 12-year-old sister Isabella had died in a foster home after being removed from their family on fabricated abuse charges. The caseworker had been bribed. The foster parents had been criminals. And by the time Sophia had graduated law school and understood how to fight the system, it was too late to save the person who'd needed saving most. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, as if summoned, clutching David's photograph and wearing one of Marcus's flannel shirts like a protective talisman. Her dark eyes took in Sophia with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned that not all adults could be trusted, but who still retained enough hope to believe that maybe this one might be different. "Hello, Emma," Sophia said, kneeling to bring herself to the child's eye level. Cheer. "My name is Sophia. I'm a lawyer, which means I help people when other people are being unfair to them." Emma studied Sophia's face with the intensity of someone reading a foreign language, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But whatever she saw there must have passed inspection, because she took a tentative step forward. "Are you going to help Uncle Marcus keep me safe from Richard?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that broke hearts, because it revealed how much adult knowledge a 6-year-old had been forced to absorb. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Sophia confirmed. And Atlas's tail gave a single thump of approval, the first sign of acceptance the dog had shown toward anyone except Marcus and Emma. The legal assessment that followed was conducted in Marcus's living room, while Emma colored at the kitchen table, Atlas positioned where he could monitor both conversations simultaneously. Sophia's evaluation was thorough and unforgiving in its honesty. Their position was precarious at best, potentially disastrous at worst. "Richard Blackwood has legal guardianship," she explained, spreading documents across Marcus's coffee table. "He's a respected attorney with no criminal record, and on paper he appears to be a concerned stepfather, seeking to recover a mentally ill child from an unstable veteran." The words hit like body blows, but Marcus had been expecting them. "And we have a 6-year-old's testimony against a man who spent his career manipulating legal systems." "We have more than that," Sophia said, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered with notes from their phone conversation. "We have medical evidence, recorded confessions, and most importantly, we have Emma herself. Children don't fake the kind of trauma responses I'm already observing." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Emma was drawing what appeared to be a house with 3 figures: a large man, a small girl, and a dog. All 3 figures were holding hands, and all 3 were smiling. "The challenge is that family courts err on the side of maintaining existing custody arrangements," Sophia continued. "We need to prove not just that Richard is unfit, but that keeping Emma with you serves her best interests better than any alternative the state might propose." Atlas padded over to where they sat, carrying one of his tennis balls in his mouth. Instead of dropping it for play, he placed it gently beside Sophia's briefcase, an offering, a gesture of tentative trust that spoke volumes about the dog's ability to read human character. "He likes you," Marcus observed, watching as Atlas settled beside Sophia's chair. "Dogs are excellent judges of character," Sophia replied, reaching down to scratch behind Atlas's ears. "And this one has obviously been trained to recognize threats. The evidence they'd need to gather the witnesses they'd need to locate, and the legal precedents that might support their case. But underneath the professional planning, Marcus detected something else in her voice. The fierce determination of someone who'd failed to save one child and refused to let it happen again. "We're not just fighting for custody," Sophia said, as snow continued to batter the cabin's windows. "We're fighting for Emma's life. And I've never lost a case where a child's life was actually on the line." The confidence in her voice wasn't bravado. It was the hard-earned certainty of someone who'd learned to win battles that mattered. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived at the cabin 3 hours after Sophia's call, driving through the blizzard with the determined competence of someone who'd spent 15 years making house calls to places where traditional medical care couldn't reach. She was a family practitioner in her early 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything, yet somehow retained enough compassion to treat each patient as if they were the only person in the world who mattered. Her medical bag was old-fashioned leather, worn smooth by countless home visits, and she carried herself with the quiet authority that came from being the only doctor willing to serve Pine Haven's rural community after the hospital had closed 2 years earlier. More importantly, she'd worked with abuse victims before, understood the delicate balance between thorough documentation and gentle care that could make the difference between justice and further trauma. "I need to examine Emma," Dr. Walsh explained to Marcus and Sophia as she removed her snow-covered coat. "Document any physical evidence of abuse, malnutrition, or neglect. But I want to do this in a way that doesn't feel like another violation." Emma had been preparing for this moment since Sophia explained its necessity. But the reality of medical examination still triggered visible anxiety. She sat on the edge of Michael's bed, clutching David's photograph, while Atlas positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact without interfering with the doctor's work. "Can Atlas stay?" Emma asked, her voice small but determined. "Of course he can," Dr. Walsh said, opening her medical bag with movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "I've heard he's been taking very good care of you." The examination that followed was conducted with extraordinary gentleness, Dr. Walsh narrating each step and asking permission before touching Emma anywhere. But despite the careful stress that would have been dangerous in an adult, let alone a 6-year-old, Atlas remained motionless during the examination, except for his eyes, which tracked Dr. Walsh's every movement with protective vigilance. When Emma's breathing became rapid during particularly difficult moments, the dog would shift slightly, not enough to interfere, but enough to remind her of his presence. "Tell me about the marks on your back, sweetheart," Dr. Walsh said gently, photographing the evidence with a clinical camera designed to capture forensic details. "Richard said I needed to learn respect," Emma replied, in the flat tone that had become her default when discussing abuse. "He said Daddy never taught me proper discipline because soldiers don't know how to raise children right." Each revelation added another piece to the puzzle of systematic abuse, but it was Emma's hidden phone that provided the smoking gun Sophia needed. The device was ancient by modern standards, a flip phone that Richard had probably assumed was broken and discarded. But Emma had kept it charged, using a car adapter she'd found, and its memory contained hours of recorded conversations that painted Richard Blackwood as a calculating predator who saw Emma as nothing more than an obstacle to financial gain. "Listen to this," Sophia said, playing back one particularly damning recording through her laptop speakers. Richard's voice filled the room, smooth and confident, as he spoke to someone identified as Carl about placement options for the Chen kid. "The group home in Spokane will take her for 18 months if we can get the psychiatric evaluation to stick," Richard's recorded voice explained. "After that, we can claim she's too damaged to maintain family placement. Once she's 18 and aged out of the system, the inheritance transfers to her next of kin, which would be her stepfather." The casual cruelty in his voice was chilling, but it was also legally actionable. Richard had essentially confessed to conspiracy, fraud, and child endangerment while assuming he was speaking privately to a co-conspirator. Building the character witnesses required reaching into David Chen's military network, and Marcus found himself making phone calls to numbers he hadn't dialed in years. The responses were immediate and unwavering. David's former comrades remembered him as a devoted father who talked about Emma constantly, shared photos obsessively, and made his battle brothers promise to watch over his daughter if anything happened to him. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos drove 6 hours through the storm from Spokane to provide testimony about David's character and his explicit wishes for Emma's care. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes submitted a written statement detailing David's exemplary service record and his frequent discussions about Emma's intelligence and potential. Captain Robert Torres provided cell phone video of David showing off Emma's artwork during their final deployment, footage that captured a father's pride so genuine it was impossible to fabricate. Atlas's role in building their case was unique but crucial. The German Shepherd's behavioral responses provided evidence that no amount of legal documentation could match. His immediate protective bonding with Emma, his trained ability to provide therapeutic support, and his obvious recognition of her connection to David Chen. When Dr. Walsh tested Atlas's responses by having Emma simulate distress, the dog's intervention was immediate and professional, demonstrating therapeutic training that most hospitals couldn't provide. "This animal has been specifically trained in trauma response protocols," Dr. Walsh explained, as she documented Atlas's capabilities. "His ability to regulate Emma's anxiety and provide emotional support is measurably beneficial to her psychological recovery." The timeline they constructed painted a horrifying picture of escalating abuse following David's death and Sarah Chen's remarriage. Medical records showed Emma's rapid weight loss after Richard gained custody. School reports documented her transformation from an engaged, curious student to a withdrawn child who flinched at sudden movements and apologized for existing. Neighbors recalled hearing Emma crying at night and Richard's voice raised in anger, though no one had been willing to intervene directly. "The pattern is textbook," Sophia explained as she organized their evidence into legal briefs. "Systematic isolation, psychological conditioning, and financial motivation. Richard Blackwood isn't just an abusive stepfather. He's a predator who identified a vulnerable family and exploited a father's death for personal gain." As the day progressed and their case file grew thicker, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his own family. Hope backed by action, purpose supported by evidence. They weren't just fighting Richard Blackwood's legal maneuvering. They were building an unshakable foundation that would protect Emma long after the immediate crisis passed. Atlas seemed to sense the shifting momentum as well. The dog's vigilance remained constant, but his body language had relaxed slightly, still protective, but no longer expecting imminent attack. He'd evaluated Sophia and Dr. Walsh as allies, expanding his protective perimeter to include the growing team assembled around Emma's defense. When Sophia finally closed her laptop and began organizing documents for transport, she looked at Marcus with something approaching confidence. "We have enough," she said simply. Richard Blackwood picked the wrong child to victimize, and he made the mistake of underestimating the people who'd fight for her. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something stronger than weather had taken to aggressive prosecution. Richard Blackwood's legal response arrived by courier at 6:47 a.m., delivered by a process server who'd driven through treacherous mountain roads to ensure immediate service. The documents were extensive: emergency custody motions, psychological competency challenges, and character assassinations wrapped in legal terminology that transformed Marcus from rescuer to kidnapper with the stroke of a judicial pen. The filings painted a picture of Marcus Thompson as an unstable veteran suffering from untreated PTSD, living in isolation, and experiencing delusions that led him to abduct a mentally ill child during a psychotic episode. Richard's legal team had done their homework, mining Marcus's military medical records, VA disability ratings, and counseling sessions to construct a narrative of dangerous instability. 30% disability for anxiety and depression. Sophia read aloud from Richard's motion. Prescribed medications for sleep disorders and mood stabilization. History of social isolation following family tragedy. Claims of military friendship with deceased father based on shared combat trauma and survivorship fantasies. The clinical language was designed to strip away Marcus's heroism and reduce him to a collection of diagnostic codes and prescription numbers. Richard's attorneys had even managed to obtain statements from VA counselors who'd noted Marcus's difficulty distinguishing between military loyalty and civilian responsibility during therapy sessions. But Richard's most devastating weapon was the media campaign that began before the legal papers were even filed. By 7 a.m., local news stations were running stories about a child kidnapping in Pine Haven, featuring Richard's carefully crafted image as a concerned stepfather, desperately seeking his missing daughter. His television appearances struck exactly the right tone, worried but controlled, grieving but determined, the perfect picture of a man whose family had been torn apart by a stranger's delusions. Marcus Thompson has been struggling with severe psychological issues since returning from combat, Richard told Channel 8 News, standing outside the courthouse in his expensive overcoat, snowflakes catching in his perfectly styled hair. Emma is a vulnerable child who requires specialized care, and I'm terrified that his untreated trauma might lead him to hurt her, even unintentionally. The story spread through social media with viral efficiency, complete with Marcus's military photo of unbearable loss. Pete Murphy, who owned a local gas station, was the first to call Channel 8 with a different perspective. "Marcus Thompson isn't dangerous," the 70-year-old mechanic told a reporter who'd been expecting confirmation of the kidnapping narrative. That man helped rebuild half this town after the tornado 2 years back. Worked for free. Never asked for thanks, just showed up every morning until everyone had their roofs fixed. The calls multiplied throughout the morning. Sarah Beth Williams, whose elderly mother Marcus had driven to medical appointments for 6 months when her car broke down. Tommy Rodriguez, the teenager Marcus had spent weekends teaching automotive repair after Tommy's father deployed to Iraq. Minister Frank Holland, who'd watched Marcus sit in the back pew of every funeral in Pine Haven for 3 years, never speaking, just honoring other people's grief with his presence. By noon, Pine Haven's residents were conducting their own counter-offensive against Richard's media blitz. They appeared at the courthouse carrying signs, not in organized protest but in spontaneous defense of a man who'd earned their respect through actions rather than words. The local newspaper editor, Janet Cross, ran an editorial titled "The Real Marcus Thompson" that included testimonials from dozens of community members who'd witnessed his character firsthand. Atlas became an unexpected weapon in their public relations battle. When Channel 8 sent a camera crew to film outside Marcus's cabin, the German Shepherd's behavior told a story that contradicted every narrative about dangerous veterans and unstable kidnapping situations. The dog was calm, alert, and obviously protective, not the aggressive, unpredictable animal that might belong to someone suffering psychological breaks. More importantly, Atlas's interaction with Emma was captured on camera, providing visual evidence that no amount of legal documentation could refute. The footage showed Emma playing fetch with Atlas in Marcus's backyard, both of them clearly comfortable and happy, the dog's protective positioning obvious but non-threatening. Emma's laughter, caught by the reporter's microphone, sounded like the joy of a child who felt safe for the first time in months. "That little girl doesn't look kidnapped to me," Janet Cross observed in her follow-up editorial. "She looks like a child who's finally found people willing to protect her." The court-appointed child advocate who arrived that afternoon expected to find a traumatized kidnapping victim and instead encountered Emma Chen Thompson, for she'd begun using Marcus's name reflexively, playing quietly in the kitchen while Atlas maintained his protective watch. The advocate, Margaret Sterling, was a social worker with 20 years' experience who'd learned to read children's responses to adult authority figures. Emma's initial wariness was appropriate and healthy. She answered questions carefully, evaluated Margaret's intentions, and looked to Marcus and Atlas for reassurance. But there was no terror, no desperate attempts to escape, none of the behavioral indicators typically found in children held against their will. "Can you tell me about Richard?" Margaret asked gently, noting how Atlas immediately moved closer to Emma when the name was mentioned. Emma's response was measured and articulate. "Richard hurt me because he wanted Daddy's money. He said if I was good and quiet, maybe he wouldn't put me in the ground, like Daddy. But Uncle Marcus and Atlas keep me safe now, like Daddy asked them to." The child advocate's report would later describe Emma as remarkably intelligent, appropriately bonded to current caregivers, and showing clear signs of recovery from previous trauma. More damaging to Richard's case was Margaret's observation that Atlas exhibited professional-level protective behaviors consistent with trained therapy animals, and that Emma's interaction with the dog suggested long-term therapeutic benefits that would be difficult to replicate in institutional settings. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving both sides 3 days to marshal their final arguments. But as Marcus watched Emma help Sophia organize legal documents while Atlas supervised from his position by the fireplace, he realized something fundamental had shifted in their battle strategy. They were no longer fighting to keep Emma safe from Richard Blackwood. They were fighting to keep Emma home, to preserve the family that had formed around shared trauma and mutual protection. To ensure that David Chen's daughter could grow up surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she was worth. The counterattack had begun, and Marcus Thompson was no longer fighting alone. He had allies, human and canine, professional and personal, who understood that some battles were worth whatever price victory demanded. Outside, the blizzard had finally begun to subside, but the real storm was just beginning to build momentum. And this time, Marcus would be ready for whatever Richard Blackwood thought he could unleash. The war for Emma's future had become something larger, a battle for the soul of protection itself, for the right of the broken to heal each other, for the principle that love could triumph over law when justice demanded it. Atlas raised his head from his paws, amber eyes reflecting the firelight, and gave a single confident bark that sounded remarkably like a battle cry. The smell of Emma's hot chocolate mingled with the pine scent of Marcus's fireplace, creating an atmosphere of domestic peace that felt almost surreal given the legal battle raging beyond the cabin's walls. But as Marcus watched Emma carefully arrange her father's photographs on survivor's guilt. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Summer 2019. The temperature outside their forward operating base had reached 127 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Taliban had been increasing their attacks on coalition patrols with methodical persistence. Marcus could still feel the weight of his combat gear, still taste the dust that had coated everything from their weapons to their water bottles, still hear the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds that had become the soundtrack of their deployment. David Chen had been assigned to Marcus's unit during their second tour, a 26-year-old officer from Seattle with a mechanical engineering degree and an infectious optimism that should have been beaten out of him within a week of arrival. Instead, David had adapted to combat with the natural grace of someone who understood that survival required both intelligence and intuition. He'd been Marcus's spotter during reconnaissance missions, his backup during firefights, and his closest friend during the long desert nights when sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. But what Marcus remembered most clearly was David's absolute devotion to his daughter. The man had carried Emma's photograph everywhere, tucked inside his helmet, taped to his rifle stock, folded into his wallet beside letters from home that he'd read until the paper began disintegrating from handling. During quiet moments between patrols, David would pull out his satellite phone and show Marcus videos that Sarah had sent from Seattle. Emma taking her first steps across their living room. Emma babbling what might have been "daddy" or might have been random syllables. Emma sleeping in her crib, tiny fists curled against her cheeks. "She's going to be brilliant," David had said one night while they shared watch duty in a bombed-out building overlooking a supply route the Taliban liked to mine. "Look at how she watches everything, processes information. By the time I get home, she'll probably be solving algebra problems." The pride in David's voice had been absolute, the kind of love that made men fight harder because they had something worth coming home to. Marcus had envied that certainty, that sense of purpose that extended beyond the immediate mission to something larger and more permanent. Atlas had been David's dog originally, assigned to their unit for explosive detection and patrol support. The German Shepherd had saved their lives countless times. His nose could identify the chemical signatures of improvised explosive devices from hundreds of yards away. His ears could distinguish between friendly and hostile footsteps in complete darkness, and his presence had provided psychological comfort to soldiers dealing with the constant stress of combat operations. But Atlas had possessed another skill that hadn't been part of his official training, an almost supernatural ability to sense emotional shrapnel during a mortar attack. Atlas had stayed beside the young soldier's stretcher until the medevac helicopter arrived, his presence providing comfort that no amount of morphine could match. When Sergeant Williams had received news of his father's death back home, Atlas had simply appeared beside his bunk and remained there until the grief had become manageable. The bond between David and Atlas had been immediate and absolute, but the dog had somehow extended that loyalty to include Marcus as well. During their final deployment, when David had been killed by a sniper's bullet during what should have been a routine patrol, Atlas had transferred his protective instincts to Marcus with the seamless efficiency of a professional soldier accepting a change in command structure. Marcus could still remember David's last conversation, the night before the patrol that would cost his life. They'd been cleaning their weapons in the armory, a ritual that served as both maintenance and meditation, when David had suddenly stopped working and looked directly at Marcus with unusual intensity. "Thompson, I need you to promise me something," David had said, his voice carrying none of its usual lightness. "If anything happens to me out here, I need you to watch over my little girl. Make sure she grows up knowing that her daddy loved her more than his own life." The request had seemed like the kind of superstitious pact soldiers made to ward off bad luck. But Marcus had agreed, without hesitation. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Chen. You're too stubborn to die in this God-forsaken desert." But David's premonition had proven tragically accurate. The sniper's bullet had found its mark during a routine patrol the next morning, and Marcus had held his battle brother's hand while life faded from his eyes, promising again to watch over Emma, to make sure David's sacrifice meant something beyond military statistics and casualty reports. Now, sitting in his cabin with Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, Marcus understood that David's concerns had extended beyond immediate military threats. Letters that Marcus had found among David's personal effects revealed growing worry about Sarah's new relationship with Richard Blackwood, anxiety about Richard's influence over both Sarah and Emma, and specific intentions to modify his will to provide additional protections for his daughter. "Richard's pushing too hard," David had written in his final letter to Sarah. "He's asking too many questions about insurance policies and military benefits. I'm changing my will to include specific guardianship provisions. If anything happens to me, I want Emma protected by people who knew me, who understand what she means to me." Atlas's behavior patterns with Emma were now serving with David's unit. Atlas wasn't just protecting a child. He was completing a mission that had been interrupted by David's death, but never officially terminated. Watching Atlas position himself between Emma and the front door while she played, Marcus realized that the German Shepherd was operating according to military protocols that recognized Emma as a high-value asset requiring constant protection. The dog's loyalty had been transferred from David to Emma, with Marcus serving as the operational commander, responsible for overall mission success. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his own family. Purpose, backed by honor, duty, supported by love. David Chen's final request wasn't just a dying man's desperate plea. It was a sacred trust between warriors who'd proven their willingness to die for each other. As Emma stirred in her sleep, and Atlas immediately adjusted his position to provide better coverage, Marcus understood that some promises transcended death, that brotherhood forged in combat created obligations that endured long after the shooting stopped. David Chen's daughter was safe, and she would remain safe for as long as Marcus Thompson drew breath. The morning sun streamed through the cabin's kitchen windows, illuminating Emma as she sat at the table, working on what appeared to be a simple coloring book. But as Marcus watched her methodical approach to the task, he began noticing details that contradicted everything Richard Blackwood had claimed about her intellectual capabilities. Emma wasn't just coloring randomly. She was analyzing the geometric patterns in the designs, discussing color theory with Atlas as if the dog were a fellow artist, and creating complex narrative backgrounds for each picture that demonstrated abstract thinking, far beyond her supposed developmental delays. "This castle needs to be blue, because blue means safety," Emma explained to Atlas, who listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to detailed briefings. "But the dragon should be green, because dragons aren't really scary. If you understand that, they're just protecting their treasure. Daddy told me that sometimes the scariest things are just afraid of being hurt." The sophistication of her reasoning was breathtaking. Emma wasn't just repeating lessons she'd memorized. She was synthesizing complex emotional concepts and applying them to creative problem-solving. Her vocabulary included words that most 6-year-olds wouldn't encounter for several more years, and she used them with precision that suggested genuine understanding, rather than mere repetition. When Sophia arrived for their daily strategy session, she brought a series of age-appropriate puzzles designed to assess cognitive function and problem-solving abilities. Emma approached each challenge with methodical intelligence, often finding solutions that demonstrated thinking patterns, typically associated with children several years older. "Show me how you would get this mouse to the cheese," Sophia said, presenting a maze puzzle that should have challenged most 8-year-olds. Emma studied the maze for less than 30 seconds before tracing the correct path with her finger. "You work backwards from where you want to end up," she explained, matter-of-factly. "Daddy taught me that when you know your objective, you can figure out the best route to get there." The military terminology wasn't accidental. Emma's vocabulary was peppered with concepts and phrases that revealed David Chen's influence on her intellectual development. She spoke casually about mission parameters and situational awareness, using complex strategic thinking to solve problems that would have stumped children twice her age. But perhaps most remarkable was the evidence that Emma had been conducting her own intelligence-gathering operation against Richard Blackwood, collecting documentation and witness testimony with the systematic patience of a trained operative. Hidden in various locations around Marcus's cabin, places she'd chosen during her first night there, Emma had stashed additional evidence that painted an even more damning picture of systematic abuse. "I learned to be invisible," Emma explained, as she showed Marcus and Sophia photographs she'd taken with her hidden phone. "Richard would hurt me more if he knew I was watching, so I pretended to be stupid and scared, but I was really gathering intelligence like Daddy taught me." The photographs were devastating in their clinical precision. Emma had documented not just her own injuries, but Richard's behavioral patterns, his associates, and conversations she'd overheard about disposing of problematic assets. She'd even managed to photograph legal documents that Richard had assumed she couldn't read, including correspondence with facilities that specialized in housing difficult children who required long-term institutional care. Atlas's interaction with Emma revealed another layer of her hidden capabilities. The German Shepherd had been trained to work with multiple handlers, but his response to Emma's commands suggested she possessed an intuitive understanding of military protocols that couldn't be explained by normal childhood development. When Emma asked Atlas to secure the perimeter, the dog immediately began a systematic patrol of the cabin's interior, checking windows and doors with professional thoroughness. "How did you know to say that?" Marcus asked, watching Atlas complete his security sweep. "Daddy showed me videos of you and Atlas working together," Emma replied. He said someday I might need to know how to work with Atlas if something happened to him. He said Atlas would remember me because dogs never forget people they're supposed to protect. The revelation that David had specifically prepared Emma to work with Atlas added another dimension to his final planning. David hadn't just asked Marcus to watch over his daughter. He'd systematically prepared her to integrate with the protective team he'd assembled around her potential future needs. Emma's drawings, scattered across Marcus's coffee table, told the story of a child processing trauma through artistic expression while maintaining hope for better possibilities. Every picture included Atlas as a central figure, always positioned between Emma and whatever threats the drawings depicted. But the art also revealed Emma's understanding of adult motivations, family dynamics, and power structures that should have been invisible to someone her age. One drawing showed a courtroom scene where a small girl stood beside a large dog, while a man in a suit pointed accusingly at them. But in Emma's artistic interpretation, the girl and dog were surrounded by a protective circle of uniformed figures who were clearly on their side. The drawing's sophistication suggested Emma understood not just what was happening to her, but why it was happening and who was involved in protecting her. Richard said I was too stupid to understand grown-up things. Emma told Sophia during one of their conversations, but I understood everything. I just couldn't do anything about it until Uncle Marcus and Atlas found me. Her emotional maturity was perhaps most evident in her ability to compartmentalize trauma without becoming overwhelmed by it. Emma could discuss Richard's abuse with clinical detachment when necessary for legal proceedings, but she could also play with childlike joy when the situation allowed for normalcy. The balance suggested resilience that had been actively cultivated rather than accidentally developed. Daddy said soldiers learn to be brave not because they're not scared, but because they're scared of the right things, Emma explained when Marcus asked how she'd managed to survive months of systematic abuse. I was scared of Richard hurting me worse, but I was more scared of not being able to tell people the truth about what he was doing. The father's influence was evident in everything from Emma's moral reasoning to her tactical thinking. David Chen had clearly spent enormous effort preparing his daughter for a complex world, teaching her not just academic skills, but survival strategies, ethical frameworks, and the kind of courage that allows someone to endure terrible circumstances while maintaining hope for justice. As Marcus watched Emma help Sophia organize legal documents with methodical precision, he realized that Richard Blackwood had made a catastrophic error in underestimating his victim. Emma wasn't just a traumatized child who needed protection. She was David Chen's daughter, carrying her father's intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking into a battle that would determine her entire future. The war for Emma's custody wasn't just about legal arguments and character witnesses. It was about proving that a 6-year-old girl was exactly who her father had raised her to be: brilliant, brave, and absolutely worthy of the protection that good people were willing to die to provide. Atlas's behavior on the third morning after Emma's rescue was different in ways that Marcus recognized from their military service together. The German shepherd paced restlessly between the front door and Emma's bedroom, occasionally whining softly and looking at Marcus with the kind of focused intensity that had preceded significant discoveries during their combat deployments. This wasn't the protective vigilance that had become Atlas's default state since Emma's arrival. This was mission-specific urgency, the kind of behavior that indicated the dog had detected something important that required immediate human attention. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside Atlas and following the dog's gaze toward the window that faced northeast, toward the abandoned military installation that local residents still called Fort Mackenzie despite its official decommissioning 3 years earlier. Atlas moved toward the front door, paused, and looked back at Marcus with unmistakable intent. The message was clear. There was something at Fort Mackenzie that required investigation. something important enough to override the dog's protective instincts about leaving Emma's side. "I need to follow Atlas somewhere," Marcus told Sophia, who was reviewing legal briefs at his kitchen table. "He's exhibiting behavior I recognize from our deployments. When Atlas acts like this, it means he's found something significant." Emma looked up from her coloring book, immediately reading the tension in both Marcus's voice and Atlas's posture. "Is it about Daddy?" she asked, with the kind of intuitive understanding that continued to amaze the adults around her. "I think it might be," Marcus replied honestly. "Atlas knew your father very well. If there's something your daddy wanted us to find, Atlas would remember where to look for it." The drive to Fort Mackenzie took 20 minutes through mountain roads that were still treacherous from the recent blizzard. The installation had been built during World War II as a training facility, expanded during the Cold War, and finally abandoned when budget cuts made its remote location impractical for modern military needs. Most of the buildings had been stripped of anything valuable, leaving behind concrete shells and rusted equipment that served as monuments to national defense priorities that had shifted with changing geopolitical landscapes. Atlas led them directly to Building 14, a nondescript administrative structure that had housed personnel records and operational archives during the base's active years. The building's exterior was scarred by weather and vandalism, but its concrete construction had kept it structurally sound despite years of neglect. Inside, Atlas navigated through debris and abandoned furniture with the confidence of someone following a familiar route. He stopped in front of a heavy filing cabinet that had somehow survived the installation's decommissioning, placed his front paws against its lower drawer, and looked at Marcus with expectant patience. The drawer was locked, but Marcus's military training included basic lock-picking skills that proved adequate for hardware that was 40 years old. Inside, beneath layers of moldering paperwork and forgotten bureaucracy, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat: a sealed, waterproof container bearing David Chen's name and military serial number. The container held treasures that Richard Blackwood would have killed to prevent from being discovered. Legal documents establishing a trust fund for Emma's education that was separate from her inheritance and couldn't be accessed by guardians for personal use. Video testimony that David had recorded specifically for use in custody disputes, featuring detailed character assessments of various people in Emma's life, and explicit instructions for her care if he didn't survive his deployment. But the most damaging evidence was a series of recorded conversations between Richard and associates discussing strategies for eliminating Emma's inheritance claims. David had somehow obtained these recordings before his death, possibly through surveillance equipment he'd installed in his own home when he began suspecting Richard's true motives. "If the kid becomes too much trouble, there are facilities that specialize in permanent placement," Richard's voice explained through David's portable recorder. "Once she's diagnosed as severely disturbed, getting her committed becomes a medical necessity, rather than a custodial preference. After that, inheritance management becomes a straightforward administrative function." The clinical discussion of Emma's potential elimination was chilling in its casual efficiency. Richard and his associates had developed contingency plans for various scenarios, including Emma's potential resistance, Sarah's possible awakening to his true nature, and legal challenges from David's military colleagues. Atlas had remained alert throughout the discovery process, occasionally moving to different positions within the building, as if following scent trails that led to additional evidence. His training in evidence detection had been focused on explosives and weapons during the military service, but those same skills translated perfectly to locating hidden documentation and recording devices. "Good boy," Marcus whispered, scratching behind Atlas's ears. as they gathered David's evidence cache. "You remembered exactly where he hid this, didn't you?" The dog's tail wagged once, their old signal for mission accomplished. Andy began leading them toward the building's exit. But he paused at the doorway, head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human perception, then turned and led them to one final location within the building. Hidden behind a loose panel in what had once been the building's communications center, David had left a handwritten letter addressed to Marcus specifically. The envelope was marked "Eyes Only, M. Thompson," in David's familiar block lettering, and its contents revealed the full scope of his concerns about Emma's future safety. "If you're reading this, it means something happened to me and you found Atlas's breadcrumbs," the letter began. "I've been gathering evidence on Richard Blackwood for months, and what I've discovered scares me more than anything I've faced in combat. This man isn't just after Emma's money. He's systematically destroying any connection she has to positive memories or healthy relationships. He's conditioning her to believe she's worthless, so she won't resist whatever disposal method he finally chooses." The letter continued with specific instructions for Emma's care, detailed explanations of the evidence David had gathered, and explicit authorization for Marcus to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to protect David's daughter from Richard's machinations. "Emma is stronger and smarter than Richard realizes," David had written. "She's been trained to survive, to gather intelligence, and to trust the right people when survival requires help. But she's still a little girl who needs someone willing to fight battles she can't win alone. I'm counting on you and Atlas to be that someone." As they drove back toward Marcus's cabin, the evidence container secure in the truck's lockbox, Marcus felt the tactical situation shifting in their favor. Richard Blackwood had based his entire strategy on the assumption that Emma was defenseless and David was dead. He'd failed to account for the possibility that David Chen had been gathering intelligence on his enemies while simultaneously preparing his daughter and his battle brothers for a war that would be fought in courtrooms rather than combat zones. Atlas rode in the passenger seat with obvious satisfaction, his mission partially complete, but his vigilance unchanged. The German shepherd had successfully guided them to the ammunition they needed for the legal battle ahead, but his protective instincts remained focused on Emma's immediate safety and long-term security. The war for Emma's future had just acquired overwhelming firepower, but the final battle would still require courage, skill, and the kind of determination that only comes from understanding that some things are worth any price victory might demand. David Chen's voice, preserved in video testimony and written instructions, would finally be heard in the courtroom where his daughter's future would be decided. And Atlas, faithful unto death and beyond, had ensured that his former handler's final mission would be completed according to plan. The ghost of Fort Mackenzie had yielded its secrets, and Richard Blackwood was about to discover that some battles can't be won through manipulation and intimidation alone. Justice, backed by evidence and protected by loyalty that transcended death itself, preparing to make its presence known. The legal documents arrived like artillery fire, each successive filing more aggressive than the last, designed to overwhelm Marcus's defense through sheer volume and complexity. Richard Blackwood had activated his professional network with military precision, deploying corporate law tactics honed through years of high-stakes litigation where victory belonged to whoever could sustain the longest, most expensive fight. The countersuits were masterfully crafted character assassinations wrapped in legal terminology. Richard accused Marcus of criminal kidnapping, custodial interference, and psychological manipulation of a vulnerable child. More damaging were the harassment charges that painted every attempt to investigate Emma's abuse as stalking behavior, every effort to document Richard's threats as paranoid delusion, every protective measure as evidence of dangerous instability. Thompson has exhibited escalating patterns of obsessive behavior consistent with combat-related psychological disorders. Read one particularly vicious filing. His fixation on the deceased David Chen has manifested in grandiose delusions about heroic duty that now threaten the safety and well-being of an innocent child. The psychological warfare was even more insidious. Richard's contacts in the medical community began questioning Marcus's fitness for guardianship, citing his VA disability rating and medication history as evidence of ongoing instability. Suddenly, every therapy session Marcus had attended became ammunition for Richard's character assassination. Every honest discussion about grief and trauma twisted into evidence of dangerous mental illness. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a psychiatrist who'd never met Marcus but had reviewed his files at Richard's request, submitted a professional opinion that was devastating in its clinical coldness. Veterans suffering from untreated PTSD often develop rescue fantasies that manifest as inappropriate attachment to vulnerable individuals who remind them of their traumatic experiences. Mr. Thompson's fixation on Emma Chen appears consistent with this pattern of maladaptive coping mechanisms. The financial pressure was relentless and methodical. Richard's law firm employed strategies designed to drain Marcus's resources through endless motions, depositions, and procedural challenges that required expensive responses. Every document demanded a counterfiling. Every accusation required expert testimony. Every legal maneuver cost thousands of dollars that Marcus didn't have. "He's trying to bankrupt you into surrender," Sophia explained during an emergency strategy session, her face grim as she tallied the mounting legal costs. It's a classic corporate impending court appearance was enough to trigger panic attacks that left her hyperventilating and inconsolable. Atlas had begun responding to these episodes with increasing urgency, his protective instincts escalating from gentle comfort to active intervention that bordered on aggressive warning displays. During one particularly severe episode, when Emma collapsed after overhearing a phone conversation about Richard's latest legal filing, Atlas positioned himself over her prone form and issued a low, rumbling growl that Marcus had never heard from the dog before. It was the sound of a warrior preparing for lethal combat, a warning that spoke of violence barely held in check. But Richard's most devastating weapon was his manipulation of Sarah Chen, Emma's mother. Using a combination of legal pressure, emotional manipulation, and carefully crafted disinformation, Richard had convinced Sarah that Marcus represented a genuine threat to her daughter's safety. Emma needs professional help, not some damaged veteran playing soldier, Sarah had told the court-appointed mediator, her voice carrying the hollow conviction of someone repeating rehearsed lines. Marcus Thompson is living in the past, unable to distinguish between his military fantasies and civilian reality. He's turned my daughter into a prop for his hero complex. The betrayal cut Marcus more deeply than Richard's direct attacks. Sarah was Emma's mother, the person who should have been fighting hardest to protect her daughter from abuse. Instead, she'd become Richard's unwitting ally, weaponizing a mother's authority against the very people trying to save her child. Richard's media campaign reached its crescendo with a coordinated series of stories about veteran violence and the dangers posed by unstable former soldiers, to vulnerable populations. The narrative was carefully constructed to exploit existing prejudices about military service members, while positioning Richard as a concerned citizen, trying to protect both his family and his community from a dangerous individual. Channel 8 News ran a week-long series titled When Heroes Become Threats, featuring interviews with unnamed experts who discussed the challenges of reintegrating combat veterans into civilian society. Marcus's photograph appeared alongside statistics about veteran suicide rates, domestic violence incidents, and substance abuse problems that painted military service as a form of psychological contamination that endangered everyone around former soldiers. The unfortunate reality is that many veterans return home carrying invisible wounds that manifest in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways. Dr. Morrison explained to the camera, her professional credentials lending authority to what was essentially character assassination. Their training in violence combined with untreated trauma creates a volatile combination. When Richard filed emergency motions to have Emma removed from Marcus's custody, pending comprehensive psychological evaluation of all parties involved. The motion requested immediate placement in a secure therapeutic environment where Emma could receive appropriate professional care while the custody dispute was resolved through proper legal channels. The child has been subjected to ongoing psychological manipulation by an individual whose documented mental health issues render him unfit for custodial responsibility, the motion argued. Each day Emma remains in Thompson's custody represents continued exposure to potentially traumatic experiences that may cause irreversible developmental damage. The threat embedded in Richard's escalating legal pressure was clear, though never stated explicitly. People who interfered with his plans faced systematic destruction of their reputations, financial resources, and community standing. Marcus wasn't just fighting for Emma's custody, he was fighting for his own survival, against an opponent who possessed both the resources and the ruthlessness to wage total war against anyone who challenged his authority. Late at night, when Emma was finally sleeping and Atlas maintained his protective vigil, Marcus would sit at his kitchen table, reviewing the mountain of legal documents that threatened to bury their case under sheer complexity. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Richard Blackwood seemed to possess unlimited resources for sustaining a prolonged legal siege. But Marcus Thompson had learned something during 3 tours in Afghanistan that no amount of corporate law experience could teach. The most dangerous enemy was often the one who appeared strongest just before his position collapsed entirely. Richard's escalation was a sign of desperation disguised as strength, and desperate enemies made crucial mistakes that patient defenders could exploit. The storm was gathering intensity, but Marcus had weathered worse tempests than Richard Blackwood could unleash. The first sign that Pinehaven wouldn't abandon Marcus Thompson came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when Pete Murphy arrived at the cabin carrying a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope thick with cash donations. The elderly gas station owner had driven through pre-dawn darkness to deliver the contributions personally, his weathered face set with the kind of stubborn determination that had kept small towns alive through economic disasters and social upheavals. "Folks around here don't take kindly to bullies," Pete said simply, handing Marcus the envelope without ceremony. "And we sure as hell don't appreciate some fancy city lawyer coming in here telling us who we can trust with our children." The envelope contained $3,847 in small bills, 5s and 10s and 20s that represented significant sacrifice for families living barely knew. Residents who'd observed his quiet dignity during 3 years of grief and had decided that his character spoke louder than Richard Blackwood's media campaign. "For Emma's legal fund," read one note in elderly cursive.
From the Henderson family, we remember how you fixed our roof after the tornado. Never asked for payment.
"Marcus Thompson is a good man," stated another in block letters that suggested military training. "Served with honor, treats folks fair. That little girl couldn't be in better hands. J. Rodriguez, Army National Guard." By noon, the informal support network had evolved into something resembling a military operation. Veterans from 3 counties began arriving at the cabin, men and women who'd served in different conflicts but shared the unbreakable bonds forged through shared sacrifice and mutual respect. They came in pickup trucks and motorcycles, wearing leather jackets and ball caps that identified their service branches, carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of people who'd faced death and chosen life. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos drove 6 hours from Billings to provide testimony about Marcus's character during their shared deployment. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to David, but proud to share the name, brought military records that documented Marcus's exemplary service and decorated combat performance. Captain Jennifer Walsh, recently returned from deployment in Syria, arrived with a folder full of character references from officers who'd served under Marcus's command. "Marcus Thompson saved my life in Kandahar," Captain Walsh told anyone willing to listen. "He's the kind of soldier who puts mission first, people always, and himself dead last. If he says that little girl needs protection, then she needs protection." Atlas became an unexpected focal point for community support. Local residents who witnessed the German Shepherd's interaction with Emma immediately understood that this wasn't a typical pet-owner relationship, but something deeper and more purposeful. The dog's obvious protective dedication, combined with his calm professional demeanor, provided visual evidence that contradicted every narrative about dangerous veterans and unstable situations. Martha Williams, who taught 2nd grade at Pine Haven Elementary, made a special trip to observe Atlas working with Emma during one of their outdoor play sessions. She watched the dog monitor Emma's activities while maintaining perimeter security, provide immediate comfort during moments of anxiety, and demonstrate the kind of therapeutic intuition that most trained professionals couldn't match.
That animal is providing better
Expanded beyond simple cash donations to include professional services and community resources. Dr. Jennifer Walsh volunteered her time for ongoing medical evaluation and documentation. Margaret Sterling, the court-appointed child advocate, began speaking publicly about Emma's obvious well-being under Marcus's care. Janet Cross, the newspaper editor, dedicated her editorial page to countering Richard's media narrative with factual reporting about Marcus's community involvement and character. Local businesses contributed with quiet efficiency that bypassed Richard's attempts to pressure potential supporters. Murphy's gas station became an unofficial headquarters for volunteer coordination. Pete's Diner provided free meals for visiting veterans who'd come to testify on Marcus's behalf. The hardware store donated materials for improving the cabin's security understanding that Emma's safety might depend on physical as well as legal protection. Sofia Rivera recognized the community's support as powerful ammunition for their legal battle. But more importantly, she understood its symbolic significance. Pinehaven's response to Richard's attack wasn't just about defending Marcus Thompson. It was about defending their right to judge character based on personal observation rather than accepting external authority about who deserved trust and protection. This kind of grassroots support is exactly what family court judges need to see, Sofia explained during a strategy session at Pete's Diner, surrounded by veterans and community members who'd become de facto campaign volunteers. It demonstrates that Marcus isn't an isolated individual with questionable judgment, but a respected community member whose character has been validated through years of consistent behavior. The media counter-narrative began taking shape as Sofia coordinated interviews and testimonials that presented the real story behind the custody dispute. Instead of accepting Richard's framing about unstable veterans and child endangerment, local media began investigating the actual facts of Emma's rescue and recovery. Channel 12 News ran a feature story titled "Community Rallies Around Rescued Child," featuring interviews with Emma's teachers, medical providers, and neighbors who'd observed her transformation from terrified victim to thriving child. The piece included footage of Atlas demonstrating his therapeutic training, Emma laughing as she played fetch, and Marcus quietly going about the daily routine of caring for a child who clearly trusted him completely. Atlas had become more than Emma's protector. He'd evolved into a symbol of loyalty and dedication that resonated deeply with people who understood that some bonds transcended species and circumstance. Veterans recognized his professional bearing and protective instincts presence during chaotic situations and realized that Marcus Thompson's judgment about appropriate protection could be trusted absolutely. The groundswell of public support created pressure on the legal system to conduct thorough investigation rather than rushing to judgment based on procedural formalities and professional credentials. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, who would preside over the custody hearing, began receiving letters and phone calls from constituents who wanted to ensure that Emma's best interests received priority over legal maneuvering and character assassination. "The court needs to understand that this case isn't about competing legal theories," wrote one particularly eloquent letter from a retired teacher. "It's about a little girl who was dying in the snow until good people risked everything to save her. If we can't protect children from predators who use legal systems as weapons, then our entire concept of justice becomes meaningless." As the day of the custody hearing approached, Pinehaven had transformed from a quiet mountain community into something resembling a military base preparing for siege warfare. The stakes had expanded beyond Emma's individual case to encompass fundamental questions about community values, veteran treatment, and the right of good people to protect vulnerable children from systemic abuse. Atlas stood watch over it all, amber eyes reflecting the knowledge that his mission had evolved from protecting one small girl to defending the principle that loyalty and love could triumph over money and manipulation. The battle for Emma's future had become a war for the soul of justice itself. The cabin Marcus Thompson once called home no longer resembled a place of rest. Under attorney Sofia Rivera's direction, it had become a war room. Every surface carried legal documents, medical records, and carefully mapped strategies. The custody hearing for 6-year-old Emma Chen would not just decide where she lived, it would decide if justice could stand against money, lies, and manipulation. Sophia worked nearly 20 hours a day. Her plan was clear: prove Richard Blackwood's abuse, show Emma's recovery under Marcus's care, and establish that this soldier, despite his PTSD, was the guardian Emma's late father had trusted. Their arsenal included David Chen's recorded testimony from Afghanistan, medical files documenting Emma's injuries, community witnesses, and Emma's own quiet strength. Emma's preparation was delicate. Sophia explained gently, "You don't have to prove anything. Grown-ups have the evidence. If you speak, it's only to tell the truth." Beside her, Atlas, the German shepherd who had once sniffed out explosives in war zones, trained for a new mission: emotional support in a courtroom. He learned to stay calm through shouting voices and sharp gestures, his role now not to fight, but to steady a child. Marcus, too, had to prepare, facing the ghosts of his service, his grief, and his own PTSD. He practiced explaining not why he deserved custody, but why Emma deserved safety. "You're not defending yourself," Sophia told him. "You're showing the court what Emma's father already knew, that you would protect her." On the morning of the hearing, the Cascade County Courthouse filled to capacity. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with townspeople. Media vans lined the street. To many, this was bigger than a custody case. It was a moral test. Richard arrived first, polished and calculated. He wore his grief like a mask, his lawyer Douglas Remick at his side. Moments later, Marcus entered in his army dress blues. Beside him, Atlas walked in disciplined step, and between them, Emma held a photo of her father. The contrast could not have been sharper. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, known for her child-first rulings, presided. Remick opened with an attack on Marcus's stability. A veteran with PTSD was unfit to raise a child, he claimed. Richard, he said, sought only proper medical care. Sophia countered with quiet fire. Marcus was the man David Chen trusted with his daughter's life. His service was not a liability, but proof of character. The testimony unfolded like a slow revelation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh displayed X-rays of Emma's healed fractures, photographs of ligature scars, records of malnutrition. "Since living with Mr. Thompson, money, he will not hesitate to harm my daughter. Trust Marcus." The room went still. Even hardened veterans wiped their eyes. Sophia next presented Atlas. When Emma feigned distress, the dog placed his paw on her shoulder, guiding her breathing. Trauma psychologist Dr. Rodriguez explained, "This is emotional regulation at a level most human therapists can't match. Atlas is her shield." The final blow came from Emma herself. With Atlas at her side, she told the court how Richard had lied, hurt her, and abandoned her at the cemetery. Her voice was small but unwavering. "Richard hurt me because he wanted Daddy's money. But Uncle Marcus and Atlas found me. Daddy said they would." When Remick tried to belittle her, she cut through his words, "I know the difference between Richard hurting me and Uncle Marcus keeping me safe." Then Emma revealed a hidden gift. Inside her father's photo frame was a micro SD card, documents and testimony David had prepared. Atlas even sniffed out more files from her backpack. It was undeniable proof of Richard's intentions. During recess, Atlas led Marcus to Richard's black Mercedes. There, spilled across the asphalt, lay forged medical records, fraudulent insurance policies naming Richard as beneficiary, and recordings of conspiracy with corrupt doctors. Sophia snapped photos. The FBI was called. When court reconvened, Sophia presented the evidence. Richard erupted, shouting that it was fabricated. Atlas shifted into protective stance as Richard lunged toward the gallery. Court officers restrained him, while FBI agents announced federal charges: fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, even plotting Emma's murder for financial gain. Judge Hawthorne's ruling was swift. Richard's custodial claims were terminated. Custody of Emma was awarded to Marcus, with Atlas recognized as an integral part of the family unit. The gallery wept. Veterans saluted. For the first time, Emma smiled without fear. On the courthouse steps, the community embraced them. Emma's mother, Sarah, shaken and repentant, begged for a chance at redemption. The court granted supervised visits, but Emma's safety would never again be compromised. Back at the cabin, Emma unpacked her small suitcase into a room that had once belonged to Marcus's son. The transformation was bittersweet. Michael's model planes now hung beside Emma's drawings of Atlas and her father. Memory and new life coexisted. Emma named the cabin Atlas Haven. Healing grew from daily rituals: oatmeal breakfasts, perimeter walks turned into games, bedtime stories guarded by Atlas. Emma thrived at school, advanced academically, and shone with empathy. At the Veterans Medical Center, she surprised everyone by calming a veteran in panic. Atlas mirrored her movements, and together began as a promise, became the Atlas Healing Teams. Their methods: one man's military discipline, one child's empathy, one dog's loyalty, outperformed traditional therapies. Veterans who had shut themselves off returned to life. Children who had lost trust began laughing again. Within 2 years, Atlas Haven expanded into a 40-acre sanctuary with therapy spaces, dorms for veterans, and training grounds for dogs. Atlas, aging but proud, trained younger German shepherds to carry on his work. Emma, wise beyond her years, became both student and teacher, her empathy shaping programs professionals came to study. The U.S. Congress passed the Emma Chen Military Family Protection Act, ensuring no child of a fallen soldier could be exploited as she had been. International delegations visited Pine Haven, adapting the Atlas Haven model worldwide. Emma chose a new name, Emma Chen Thompson. "I want to keep Daddy's name, because I'm proud to be his daughter," she told the court. "But I want Uncle Marcus's name too, because he kept Daddy's promise." A year later, at David Chen's grave, Emma laid wildflowers and whispered, "Uncle Marcus and Atlas kept their promise, Daddy. I'm safe, and now I'm helping others be safe too." Atlas, graying, stood beside her with the dignity of a comrade honoring the fallen. By then, Atlas Haven had served dozens of veterans and children. Emma thrived in advanced studies, spoke at conferences, and trained puppies with methods that astonished professional trainers. Marcus became a national advocate for trauma recovery. Together, they built not just a family but a movement. On Christmas morning, beneath a tree adorned with medals, photos, and handmade ornaments, Emma buried her face in Atlas's fur. "Thank you for finding me in the snow," she whispered. "Thank you for teaching me that families can be made of people who choose each other." Marcus watched, tears in his eyes. His grief had transformed into purpose. His friend's sacrifice had birthed something enduring. Atlas thumped his tail slowly, his amber eyes reflecting firelight and peace. Their story had begun in tragedy: an abandoned child, a grieving soldier, a war dog without a mission. It ended in triumph, a family forged by loyalty, a sanctuary that healed hundreds, and a legacy that would ripple outward for generations. The promise had been kept, the healing was shared, and the love that bound them together would endure forever. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from medicine or therapy, but from the unwavering love of a loyal companion. Atlas showed us what German shepherds have always known, that true devotion means standing guard over those we love. Even when the world seems impossibly dark, the bond between Marcus, Emma, and Atlas reminds us that our dogs aren't just pets. They're family members who possess an almost mystical ability to sense our pain and offer comfort that never wavers, love that never judges, and hope that never dies. If this story touched your heart and made you think about the special connection you share with your own dog, you might find it meaningful to explore ways to deepen that bond. There's something beautiful about understanding your dog's unique language of love, those subtle signals and behaviors that speak to their incredible intelligence and devotion. Your dog is already trying to tell you how much you mean to them. Sometimes we just need to learn how to listen.